Hey humans, I'm sitting on the banks of Birrarung, the Yarra River, and I'm in the heart of Melbourne CBD. It's the end of the day, which means that there's a rush of people moving across the bridges here. I can hear music playing on the other side. People are catching up for drinks post-work. There's rowers on the river going up and down. I can hear seagulls overhead. It's busy, but it's also kind of peaceful. To my right is Queen's Bridge. It's quite a low bridge, and it was built in 1889. It carries an almost unending stream of pedestrians, trams, cars, and cyclists across the river below. To my left, and further along the river, you can see Flinders Street and Flinders Street Station, which is also recognisable in its current form since the 1880s. Both the bridge and the station are pretty hard to miss from where I'm sitting. There's also something else here which is likely invisible to most passers-by. Its presence provides a clue as to what the site may have looked like prior to the dominance of these two colonial landmarks. It's a small outcropping of basalt rock on the other side of the river, near the base of the bridge. You see, prior to the 1880s, a crossing already existed here. It was a natural basalt ridge, and it was an important crossing and meeting place for local Aboriginal people. It also marked the divide between upstream freshwater and downstream salty water. This ridge was blown up by colonists in 1883 in response to flooding experienced in the relatively new city of Melbourne. This destroyed an important ancestral site, and it radically changed the river's local ecology by shifting the fresh and saltwater divide several kilometres upstream to Dights Falls in Clifton Hill. I'm starting this episode with this story as it's one small example of how a conversation with Birrarung can illuminate our shared history. The project of colonisation was often one of intentional violence towards Indigenous people and the environment. I think one of the things that drew me towards the story we're exploring this season was that it introduces a novel way to engage in truth-telling and reconciliation on both of those fronts. It's an attempt at recognising and respecting the perspectives and values that were ignored or vandalised in our past. The history of this crossing was also a useful analogy to kick off the ideas we'll be exploring in this episode. Just as the visible reminder of the original crossing remains, despite being demolished and replaced with an imposing bridge, traditional owner law, LAW, and law, LORE, relating to the river both persist in spite of settler-colonial legal systems that have often deliberately attempted to erase them. So what happens when you attempt to reconcile these two knowledge systems? How does a better way of existing with and beside a river like Birrarung emerge from the diversity of opinions and complex answers to that question? Hey humans, I'm Tim McIntosh Hanna, back in the studio, and you're listening to the second episode in our series Living with Birrarung. In episode 1, we introduced several of our guests for this season and heard their thoughts on what it means for a river to be alive. If you missed that episode, you can pause now and go back and catch up. In 2017, this river was recognised as one living and integrated entity in a piece of legislation that came before the Victorian Parliament. But, as we established in episode 1, this was recognition of something that was already known by traditional owners. So, how did this latest act of recognition come about? Who was and continues to be involved? Can settler-colonial and traditional owner law exist alongside each other? Welcome back to More Than Humans series Living with Birrarung. This is episode 2, Life and Law. There is a lot of legislation and regulation governing the Yarra River, and I mean a lot. The Yarra Riverkeeper Association has a handy list on their website, including at least 15 separate pieces of state policy and legislation before you even reach the list of individual council, public entity and community plans and schemes. This fragmented system can make understanding how the river is governed and who is responsible really confusing for the uninitiated. So, for this episode, we're going to focus on two key documents introduced in our first episode. Both have titles in English and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung language. The first is the Yarra River Protection Wilip-gin Birrarung Muron Act of 2017, which translates as Keep the Birrarung Alive. The second is Burndap Birrarung Burndap the Yarra Strategic Plan 2022 to 2032, which translates as What is good for Birrarung is good for all. Andrew Kelly, who we met in our first episode, was close to the action in the lead up to 2017, when the Act was introduced to Parliament.
Up until August 2020, I was the Yarra Riverkeeper. I was in the role for about 7 years, following on from Ian Penrose, who was in the role for 9 years. And I started the role in just before the 2014 election of the Andrews government.
For our international and interstate listeners, that's the state Labor government that was led by Premier Daniel Andrews from 2014 to 2023, when Andrews retired from politics and Jacinta Allen, the current Premier, stepped into the leadership.
I'd been on the committee of the association before that, and Ian decided to step down, and I put up my hand to step up. And so that was my first significant involvement in kind of water policy. I had a brief brush with a stream flow management committee via Environment Victoria, but that was my first start. And it was a really exciting time to start because the committee, Ian primarily, but myself as well, and other committee members had lobbied for a Yarra Act and a Yarra Trust. But Ian was very instrumental in it to get it into Labor policy, and then it was my task as Riverkeeper to keep it moving and to ensure government kept their promise.
That promise that Andrew refers to was a commitment in the 2014 state election to introduce a Yarra River Protection Act to guard the river from inappropriate development. So, keeping in mind that Victorian election terms are 4 years, Andrew is referring to a push to ensure that commitment was met before the next state election in 2018.
I think in some ways it's the crowning achievement in environmental terms for the current Labor government, both under Jacinta Allen and Daniel Andrews. The water stuff, specifically the living entity work. Significantly, it was an act that came out of community. It came out of the Yarra Riverkeepers Association lobbying, and Ian took Brian T, who was the Shadow Minister at the time, out on the boat. And then we also went and saw Lisa Neville. I remember that, going to Parliament. We lobbied parliamentarians. Hence it got into the Act. I think it was quite transformative, that trip on the river, to take, as Yarra Riverkeeper, you're really privileged to have a boat that you go out on regularly. And the core thing you do really is to not only to learn about the river, but to take influences of various descriptions, not in the narrow social media sense, but influences in terms of politicians, etc., out on the boat so they can see the river. And that can be very transformative, I think, in those people's experience.
What followed that lobbying was the formation of the Yarra River Protection Ministerial Advisory Committee in 2016. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there are a lot of committees and advisory groups mentioned in this episode. Don't stress if you can't remember all of them. There's no test at the end. But do perhaps spare a thought for me as I try to keep track of them all as we continue. Crucially, this committee brought traditional owners into the conversation about the river's future.
It was done with the Ministerial Advisory Committee, which it was formed to consult, which is not something government always does. So that's appointing outsiders to really make the decisions for government. During that process, the Ministerial Advisory Committee spoke to the traditional owners, the First Nations people of Melbourne, and at that point the First Nations people said, look, you're not just consulting with us, we're partners in this, we're sovereign partners in this. You have to include us in a greater way than consultation. So that caused a bit of a hiatus, and I guess we, as the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, then put quite a bit of pressure on government to deliver, to meet their promises. So, I see it as a kind of joining up of community and traditional owners, even though there was no direct joining up at the time, to drive an act that is kind of exceptional, I think, in the way it came about. Not only in the way it came about, but in the thinking that underpins it.
That thinking, as we've seen, includes considering how the river is understood from the perspective of traditional owners. I will quickly skim over the next steps here, as I know my head starts to swim when we get too deep into the processes of government. But essentially, the advisory group, including traditional owners, led to a public consultation, which led to a report with recommendations, which led to an action plan, and finally, to the Act introduced into Parliament in 2017. In 2026, when this episode is being published, I think many of us have a fairly limited understanding of the opaque workings of government, and perhaps a sense of powerlessness in the decisions and policies that influence our lives. I certainly feel a certain cynicism about the role of powerful actors, usually those with a lot of money. I find it encouraging to see an example of community and traditional owners driving political action, an example of what collective action can achieve when we're all striving for the same goal. When we spoke, Andrew also pointed out that the Act was really an act for a plan. The Act outlines the principles for protection of the river and the definition of what is considered riverland. It also created the legislative context for the creation of a long-term community vision for the river, which informed the development of a Yarra Strategic Plan. It established an independent voice for the river as well, the Birrarung Council. We're going to spend the rest of this episode on those final two items. But before we do, I think it's worth acknowledging a couple of ways this act was unique and groundbreaking. It was this act, Wilip-gin Birrarung, that first acknowledged Birrarung as one living and integrated natural entity. When the act was introduced into Parliament, it also marked the first time Wurundjeri elders, as traditional owners, addressed Parliament itself, voicing their support for the act. Here is Uncle Andrew Gardner, who you might remember from our first episode, noting the significance of this moment when I spoke with him in August of 2025.
Importantly, it had our elders talking on the floor of Parliament as it was being tabled. So they were a part of that procession into the House and reading through their script that they'd developed over a couple of weeks to be specific, to be quite specific, and have it done within a certain time frame. So they couldn't just sit there for hours talking. But they put it into Birrarung language. They spoke it, it was recorded into Hansard, and so that being sets a precedent. Sets a precedent because there's another piece of legislation that's coming up that's going to get tabled on the 26th of August, which is the new treaty bill.
So to reiterate what Uncle Andrew was saying, the introduction of the 2017 Act was significant both for what it introduced and how it introduced it. Our legal system respects precedent, and the acknowledgement and expression of traditional owner sovereignty helped prepare the path for more ambitious action in the years since. We have a whole episode planned where we will focus on traditional owner relationships with Birrarung and their aspirations for their future with the river. For now, I highly recommend you look at the links in our show notes, including a link to the full speech delivered to Parliament by Auntie Alice Kalasa in July 2017. I also want to highlight the importance of the inclusion of Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung language in the titles of both the Act and the Strategic Plan. Acts and Strategic Plans often have very dry titles. The Woi-wurrung titles afford them both a sense of momentum and purpose. Wilip-gin Birrarung, Keep the Birrarung Alive, is a call to action. Burndap Birrarung, Burndap umarkoo, What is good for Birrarung is good for all, tells us why the plan exists, because we're all in this together. These titles emphasize the important role that traditional owner knowledge and worldviews can play, ensuring custodianship and reciprocity are central to how we approach river governance. Burndap Birrarung umarkoo, the Yarra Strategic Plan 2022 to 2032, came into effect in 2022. I think the best place to start to understand this particular plan is with the lead agency that's responsible for it.
I'm Claire Dunn, the Burndap Birrarung umarkoo Implementation Manager for Melbourne Water as lead agency for Burndap Birrarung umarkoo.
I met with Claire at Melbourne Water's offices in early 2026. We started with the basics. What is Burndap Birrarung umarkoo?
So Burndap Birrarung umarkoo is the name of our inaugural Yarra Strategic Plan. It's a 10-year plan guiding investment, action, collaborative effort to protect and improve the state and health of Birrarung. It's the first Yarra Strategic Plan under the Yarra River Protection Wilip-gin Birrarung Muron Act 2017. And under the Act, there was a requirement to develop a 10-year strategic plan for the Yarra. So Burndap Birrarung umarkoo is a 10-year plan, 2022 to 2032, designed to protect and support the health of Birrarung. And I suspect, I'm not sure, but I suspect the reason that was the duration was because at the heart of the plan is collaboration, and we all know that collaboration takes time. And also the plan and the Act both really centre and promote traditional owner involvement and decision making. And we also all know that traditional owner groups are under a lot of pressure, and it's important that they have the time to follow their own processes to provide their preferred input.
I think this is a really important point to emphasise. From the outside, these kinds of projects can seem to move at a glacial pace. But we need to remember that traditional owners in Victoria are under increasing pressure to meet an ever-increasing list of demands, often from government and community groups. A lot of this is well-meaning, but there is still a large resource and capacity gap for many traditional owner groups. They need time, money, and people to ensure they are at minimum equal partners and ideally the leaders in this work. Returning to Melbourne Water, what does it mean for them to be the lead agency?
So Melbourne Water was appointed officially as the lead agency back in October 2019, but Melbourne Water had actually been leading the process in terms of community engagement and the like since 2017. We have a number of obligations under the Act in terms of reporting to Birrarung Council on progress of implementation of the plan. We also have a number of other responsibilities around ensuring there is a collaborative governance model and collaborative implementation of the plan. One of the ways we do that is through the Yarra Collaboration Committee, which we convene. It comprises representatives of the 8 councils along the Birrarung corridor, Department of Transport and Planning, Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, VicTrack, Victorian Planning Authority, Parks Victoria, and the traditional owner groups. So Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation and Bunurong Land Council Aboriginal Corporation.
So we can see Melbourne Water's role here as a kind of connector, like the friend in a group chat that's organised enough to get everyone together on the same day. It's worth emphasising the progress this represents in terms of care for Birrarung as a single entity. The Yarra Collaboration Committee is really one of the first successful attempts to bring together all of the responsible public, that is, government entities, with obligations along the full length of the river to coordinate their actions and care for Birrarung's health. It's an example of how new forms of governance can directly emerge from a new way of thinking of the river as one living and integrated entity.
The Act and the plan really invite, and some might say compel, but certainly invite and encourage all of the responsible public entities, so state and local government, as well as traditional owners, to approach Birrarung as one living and integrated natural entity, so to think beyond your boundaries, your normal sort of operational constraints, and work out how we best work together in service of Birrarung.
The strategic plan emerged from an extensive process of community engagement. Melbourne Water have actually published the full engagement plan on their website, which we'll link in the show notes. The 4 phases of this engagement plan begin with the development of a long-term 50-year community vision for the river, then move through drafting the plan, testing it, and then going through a round of public consultation. The 50-year community visions are a beautiful starting point, developed by a committee of community members representing all 4 reaches or defined sections of the river. These reaches are the upper rural, lower rural, suburban, and inner city. There are some great videos and resources for these visions that we'll also link in the show notes. The visions are also complemented by a separate vision statement that was produced by the Wurundjeri, which we'll also link. I was curious as to why the river was divided into these sections for the purpose of these visions. It seems at first glance to go against the idea of a single living integrated entity that we've been focusing on.
My understanding of the rationale for that was that right along the length of Birrarung, over 242 kilometres of length, we have highly engaged, highly passionate communities who wanted to see their vision and their wants and needs reflected in the plan. And so, although the Act and the plan are focused on Birrarung as one living and integrated natural entity, it also does recognise that sometimes the ambition or the aspirations or the priorities vary between communities and between reaches.
This diversity is something we're going to explore further as we go through this season. It makes sense that you might have a different perspective on your relationship with the river if you rely on it to irrigate your land, as opposed to if you live in central Melbourne and maybe have a more aesthetic or recreational motivation. A key challenge for Melbourne Water, as the lead agency, is reconciling these diverse opinions across the whole integrated entity. I imagine it a little like one of those collages of thousands of small images that form a portrait as you zoom out. It was clear in the conversation with Claire that this is a challenge, and like many of those we've heard from so far, it's an ongoing journey.
So I think it would be fair to say that the river's status as one living and integrated natural entity is something that we're all on a journey to understand, especially as state and local government agencies. I think a great resource for people trying to wrap their heads around relating to Birrarung as one living and integrated natural entity are the Birrarung Council's annual reports, both the most recently released one for 2025, but also the previous annual report, where they provide really useful information and tips around how things like our language impact how we relate to Birrarung and how we understand Birrarung as a living entity. So on a sort of a specific example might be to move away from language that refers to managing the river and its lands to caring for and protecting. So it's for the likes of an engineer or a transport planner or the like, it really is an invitation to change our way of thinking and then really prioritising the health of Birrarung in all the work that we do. We're on a journey, but we are making progress.
So taking into account the community visions and the extensive engagement, what actually ended up in the strategic plan?
The plan includes 40 actions that are really designed to help deliver on the 4 performance objectives that are set out within the plan.
Those 4 performance objectives focus on protecting healthy river and lands, cultural diversity, quality parklands, and the natural beauty of the river corridor.
And the actions, you'll see right through them, at their heart is collaboration, different levels of government working together, working with traditional owners, community, friends of groups and the like. And all of those actions are really about delivering on those 4 performance objectives around the health of the river, about recognising the cultural values of the river, community enjoyment of the river and the river's lands, and so on. It's about delivering on the community vision.
As a quick snapshot, the 40 actions include things like addressing water quality, habitat and landscape restoration, knowledge and skill development, climate change action, cultural heritage protection, and infrastructure development. They include collaboration with traditional owners and community to enhance and protect the Birrarung corridor for everyone. The plan is also divided into 2 sections. The first includes those 40 actions already mentioned. The second addresses a fairly large elephant in the room, the impact of land use planning and development, and the need to implement a better land use framework along the river.
I think we all know that land use planning and how land is developed and used immediately affects the lands and our waterways. And that is very much at the heart of having land use planning the focus of part 2 of the plan. So my understanding is prior to the plan being launched, we had some interim planning protections put in place for the river. Those were then made permanent. We had a really significant planning scheme amendment go through last year to improve protection of Birrarung and Birrarung's lands. And there's still further work happening to ensure that the right planning protections are in place. But we know the land use planning system is critical to protect and support the health of Birrarung.
The tension between development and the river is a challenge that's unlikely to be resolved quickly. As we were recording this episode, stories about the impacts of Melbourne's North East Link freeway project on the river and groundwater were popping up in the news. The impact of contamination from construction sites is a semi-regular fixture, as local streams are turned neon blue or are clogged with plastic. Many of our arterial transport networks follow current or now hidden waterways, or cut underneath them or cross them. Every project is almost certain to come into conflict with a waterway, and anyone living in Melbourne right now would be aware of how many large-scale infrastructure projects are either underway or planned for the next decade. I don't really have a good answer for this challenge in this episode, but I do want to return to it. Burndap Birrarung, Burndap Umarkoo also includes 5 priority projects. These are perhaps the more highly visible elements of the plan, and chances are you've seen them in action even if you didn't realise it.
For people who want to learn more about the plan, a good starting point would be to look at the 5 priority projects, which you can find details of in our last annual report. You'll see that collaboration is very much at the heart of each of the projects. One of them is community-led through the Yarra Riverkeeper Association, which focuses on polystyrene pollution and has produced 2 really important reports that will help guide action and will hopefully also influence some of the pollution that is stemming from private sector as well, specifically the construction industry. There's the City of Melbourne Birrarung Floating Wetlands Project. It's deeply loved by the community. Citizen science is informing an assessment of the project. And again, I'd highly recommend people, if you're in the lower reaches of the Birrarung, to visit the floating wetlands.
You can actually see these floating wetlands from the train window between Flinders Street and Southern Cross stations as you go past the aquarium.
We also have the Birrarung Rangers program, which is being led by Wurundjeri, and this is really about empowering Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Rangers to make informed and culturally appropriate decisions regarding water management. So it's really a capacity building project that not only benefits those involved, but absolutely will also benefit country.
Now, it's impossible to cover the full detail of the strategic plan in one, albeit long, episode. We'll provide lots of links in the show notes, and if this has perked your interest, I would really encourage you to take a look and see if there's a project near you that you can volunteer to support. There are so many opportunities to get involved, and as Claire said when we were wrapping up,
one highly important message that the Act and the plan reinforce is that caring for Birrarung is a shared responsibility, not only of government but also of community, working with our traditional owners and indeed the private sector. We all have a role to play, and if a Birrarung is healthy, then that will also support our health. Or in the words of the name of the plan, Burndap Birrarung, Burndap Umarkoo, what is good for Birrarung is good for all.
We'll be right back to unpack the Birrarung Council and some of the challenges in meeting the expectations and the ambition of the Act and Strategic Plan right after this short break.
G'day humans, Mark here, co-producer of More Than Human with Tim. The reason I'm popping up here now is a new voice means new attention, and this is something that Tim and I wanted a bit of attention for. More Than Human is a conversation. Now, as you've heard from this episode and episode 1, and in the coming episodes in the season, there's a lot of conversations. Tim mostly removes his side of things to give you that lovely studio feel, and to help give some greater context and perspective and draw some attention back to some of the things his guests are saying. But one voice we really want to hear is yours. This show is a conversation, and we want that conversation on how our perspective on the more than human world is reaching you and what your thoughts and responses and reflections are. So we've made that really easy. From our website, morethanhumanpod.net, you can easily leave us a voicemail. Whether you're on your phone, on your way to and from work, or maybe while out enjoying nature, or even from your computer, you can send us a voicemail. Guarantee you we will listen to it, and if you give us permission, which you can do when leaving a voicemail, we may play it on the show. So if you, like me, have had some really strong responses to the show so far, and you'd like to let us know what those are, we'd love to hear from you. And there's another way we'd really love to get feedback from you. If you listen to any other podcasts or watch anything on YouTube, you know what's coming. Yes, we would love and really appreciate a review. Wherever you listen to the show on your podcast app of choice, we're getting comments from people on Spotify, on YouTube, and we'd also love some ratings of the show. This is a huge help for a small independent show like More Than Human. So if you can take a minute to leave a review, which will help others find the show, we would greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to leave a review but need some help, just drop us a line. There's a contact page on morethanhumanpod.net, and we will come back to you to help. But yes, a review in the podcast app you use would be fantastic. Thank you. And now, back to Tim.
As mentioned earlier, the 2017 Act also established a new governing body for Birrarung, the Birrarung Council. So, what is the Birrarung Council?
So, Birrarung Council kind of 101 here.
This is Dr. Erin O'Donnell, who you may also remember from episode 1. Erin is a member of the Birrarung Council alongside Uncle Andrew Gardner, who is actually now the chair of the council.
When we look at the Wilip-gin Birrarung Act, which means keep Birrarung alive in English, Birrarung Council is established as the voice of Birrarung. The majority of the Birrarung flows through Wurundjeri country. Wurundjeri have known the river for tens of thousands of years, so they know it well enough. So I think in its essence, Birrarung Council could not operate as a voice of Birrarung without the participation of Wurundjeri elders and a Bunurong elder for the mouth of the river as well. So without that, it would not be a valid expression of the voice of the river. Now, the Act does acknowledge that in a small way. Birrarung Council must have 12 people. There's a chair of the council. The Birrarung Council members are appointed by the minister. There must be at least 2 traditional owner members on the council. Mainly, I think, because there are 2 traditional owner groups in the footprint of the river. But that doesn't go far enough. And so one of the first things that Wurundjeri had to do was to establish 2 things. One, that they needed 3, as a minimum, representatives from Wurundjeri because there are 3 clan groups. And 2, they had to have the authority to nominate their people as they see fit, and the minister really, for the most part, needs to accept that. So, sure, there are minimum standards around things that a person needs to have in order to be appointed by a minister, but the minister doesn't interrogate the choice that Wurundjeri are making. So it's an expression of sovereignty that's really powerful. And it's one of the first times in the history of Victoria that a traditional owner group has been able to require a minister to accept their nominations in that way. Again, that's something that should be happening more often. Birrarung Council is kind of a model for that.
Again, in case you needed to hear it from a lawyer too, the establishment of the Act, the Strategic Plan and the Birrarung Council, but also importantly how they were established, set an important precedent for traditional owner sovereignty and opened a new chapter in the relationship between the state and traditional owner groups.
The other members of the council are community representatives in different ways. So they might represent community interests or irrigator interests from different parts of the catchment, or have particular skill sets. And the Act actually spells out what some of those skill sets might be, like landscape architecture and statutory planning and aquatic or waterway management. So the Act prescribes the composition of the council. The Act also says that the council has a couple of really key responsibilities. So we need to advise the minister. In this instance, it's the Minister for Water. We do that through our annual report. And again, the Act is really specific about this. So we have an important integrity function that's created by the Act. So the Act says we write to the Minister every year. We have to submit an annual report that holds all of the other government entities that have responsibilities under the Act to account for those responsibilities. And every year we have to submit it by the 31st of October. The Minister then has to table it in Parliament within 7 sitting days. And so again, that's in the legislation. So this is the voice of Birrarung being heard in Parliament. It's being presented in an unedited way. So we take that statutory obligation very seriously. We also have a second statutory obligation, which is the requirement to advocate for the interests of the river. And this is part of what being the voice means. So we have to think about, how do we understand the river's interests? And then how do we give voice to those? Recognising that we are a very small group of people. And I realise I'm speaking in first person about Birrarung Council. So there's only 12 members of the council, and the council has a very small budget. And so one of the ways that the council gives effect to that advocacy role is to hold what we call yarning circles. And that's when we invite the very senior leadership, so the CEOs, the managing directors of those responsible government entities, into conversation with us. And so they get inducted, there's a smoking ceremony, they have to follow particular protocols to participate in this culturally led way of conversing and sharing. And we get to not only hold them to account, but also help them learn and grow about their relationship with the river, how they're giving effect to their obligations under the Act, and start to push them a little bit, to go further, to do more, to understand what their barriers are so that we can advocate for those barriers to be lifted.
One of the first questions I asked in this episode was what happens when you try to reconcile settler-colonial and traditional owner knowledge systems. I'm intentional in the use of the word reconcile here, as this is not a question about how we integrate traditional owner law into settler-colonial law. Rather, how can both systems exist side by side? I don't feel I can speak to the success of the approach, but the use of yarning circles that Erin describes represents an attempt to do that. This acknowledgement of a need for two approaches to coexist is captured in the Birrarung Council's Walking Together with Birrarung statement, which is published in their annual report. It states that, quote, "The strength of the council is that it brings Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together." Again, we've linked the 2025 annual report in the show notes. The full statement is a beautiful summary of the council's approach and worth reading. Our intention in this series is to demonstrate the ways in which we can build better relationships with Birrarung, and by extension other natural and living entities. We want to encourage momentum towards a greater awareness of our place in the more than human world. However, this is a journey, and I'm cautious about leaving you with the impression that it's all smooth sailing. Just like the river itself, the way is murky. Snags lie beneath the surface that harbour a diversity of feelings and opinions about the future of relations with the river. It is from airing these diverse feelings and opinions that new crossings and gathering places will be co-created. So I do want to dedicate some time to acknowledging them, both now and throughout the series. Let's start with something that Erin had to say that honestly really caught me by surprise.
Yeah, so Section 1A of Wilip-gin Birrarung Act says that one of the purposes of this legislation is to recognise the river and its lands as a single living integrated natural entity. So the river is really the bed and the banks. It implies water, but it doesn't explicitly say water.
You may recall that in episode 1, we noted that in order to really work with the river as one living and integrated natural entity, we should be mindful to make any necessary definitions of the river as broad as possible. When we say river or birrarung, we want to know that those names are shorthand for the whole river, not just an arm or a leg. You, like me, may assume that when someone says river or birrarung, we're talking about water. After all, surely a river is water, or at least defined by it in some way. Does it really matter if the Act's language isn't explicit in this? Well, yeah, it kind of does. And explaining why gets a little complex, so I'll let Erin take over.
Under settler state law, water is managed under the Water Act 1989, and there are zero connections between Wilip-gin Birrarung Act and the Water Act 1989. So Birrarung Council has no ability to hold water decision makers to account for their decisions with respect to water. We do have relationships with people that make water decisions. So, for instance, the Minister for Water is now the Minister administering Wilip-gin Birrarung as well as the Water Act. So we're speaking to the same minister. Melbourne Water is a key responsible public entity under Wilip-gin Birrarung, and of course they do have significant waterway management functions as well as water resource management functions for water generally in the city of Melbourne. But there's no ability for us to hold them to account for their water resource decision making under Wilip-gin Birrarung. So you've got a river legislation, the most specific form of river legislation in Australia's history as a settler state nation, that is tied to a specific river, that recognises the agency and the living nature of that river, and yet does not connect that recognition to the way that the water itself is cared for and managed. So it is an enduring gap. I'm very hopeful that the Victorian government is going to be addressing that gap with some new legislation coming out of a policy document called Water is Life, which is the Victorian government's Aboriginal water rights policy document.
We'll share a few links to information about Water is Life in the show notes, and we might return to this later in the season. For now, it's worth knowing that it is the Victorian State Government's roadmap for traditional owner access to water, and work is ongoing.
And the number one outcome in that, the very first outcome that they committed to do, is to recognise all waterways around the state of Victoria as living entities and traditional owners as a unique voice for those waterways. So it's modelled a little bit on the Birrarung idea, but it takes it across the state. What we are starting to see from them in the early stages of drafting this legislation is that it could include amendments to the Water Act to start building that connection between living entity status and the way that we care for water. That would be incredibly important.
I think it's probably uncontroversial to acknowledge that a piece of water legislation written in 1989 is a little out of date in 2026. Since then, we've seen the impacts of climate change accelerate, and we've seen the acknowledgement of those impacts, and the momentum towards acknowledging and supporting traditional owner sovereignty has grown considerably. Amendments and incremental improvements are a feature of how our policy and politics work, but it can feel frustratingly slow. Andrew Kelly expressed this when we discussed the Birrarung Council.
I was a member of the council, and I have been maybe a little bit critical of the council at times. There is an independence principle in the Act. I don't know how independent the council is of government. I think independence is always a difficult thing to achieve. And I think sometimes the council has focused on softer outcomes, like changing the mindset, when I guess my natural character is to want hard outcomes, like changes to the planning schemes, penalties, and funding.
I think Andrew's point here is a legitimate concern. Clearly, because I've chosen to devote an entire podcast series to it, I believe there is benefit in the shifting of mindsets, those softer outcomes. But I completely understand Andrew's interest in also wanting to see concrete action to protect and improve the river. We could get into a chicken and egg argument here. Does the mindset come before the action, or does the action create the mindset? Speaking with each guest I've interviewed for this series, I suspect it's a bit of both, depending on where you're starting your journey from. Andrew also praised Birrarung Council for other aspects of its work. It was something that really stood out in all of these interviews. There is a genuine mutual respect between all involved, despite the diversity and sometimes disagreement. Everyone understands that they are working in an incredibly complex area, and that there is a lot of progress being made relatively quickly.
I would say that I think the Birrarung Council has achieved quite a lot, really, and a lot of it has been around traditional owners' voice that they've, and I think the council has become more assertive as traditional owners within the council have found their voice. And I was on the council, so I don't think that was an easy task. I think our systems of government are stacked against traditional owners in quite subtle and hard to easily identify ways. Like, they don't come to the surface immediately, and they're hard to put your finger on. So I think with the yarning circles and other initiatives, and with increased strength of traditional owner voices within the council, I think that's been a really powerful thing. I thought once that once you got the legislation through, that was it. But legislation doesn't always work. It doesn't always get acknowledged. It gets ignored by government. There has to be a willingness from government to implement legislation and implements aspects of legislation for it to actually happen.
So there's a need for accountability and advocacy, both to hold decision makers to account and to push them to further action. As we've heard, this is the role of Birrarung Council. But Andrew's comments do raise a question for me. Who gets a seat at the table when all of these matters are discussed? As we've seen, community were a significant force in the creation of both Wilip-gin Birrarung muron and Burndap Birrarung Burndap umarkoo. But Andrew also asked if there could be a greater ongoing role for the broader community in governance, like the Birrarung Council and decision-making bodies. It's a feature of government programs, for better and worse, that they often involve and consult with community, but tend to fall short of genuine empowerment. This was another challenge that I put to Claire, and she acknowledged that it's a priority for her team to involve community, and there is still a lot of work to do in supporting that.
I think a key priority for the lead agency team, which I lead, is to ensure that we properly acknowledge the extraordinary contribution of community, not only in the lead up to the development of the plan and even the commitment from government to pass the Act, but also their ongoing involvement through friends of groups, through their embracing of festivals like Birrarung Riverfest, which the Yarra Riverkeeper Association run each year. We want to make sure that the community see that we recognise and value their contribution, and that will be a real priority for us in our annual reporting. So we took a step forward with our annual report last year, and that's a continued focus for us. There is great community care and love for Birrarung, and we want to make sure we're both celebrating and supporting that as much as we can.
I want to finish this episode with a final reflection from Erin that brings all of this back to our main focus for this series, the Birrarung as a living entity. Since its introduction in the 2017 Act and the beginning of the journey towards truly embedding it in our understanding and relationship with the river, what has living entity achieved?
So I think we can chart the power of living entity through the conversations it creates. And I can see three distinct narratives. One that has been here for a very long time, and two that are coming into being because of living entity. So the first one that's been here since colonisers arrived and invaded these shores is, what can we take from the river? The river is still an ecosystem services provider. It provides water, it is a drainage line for stormwater, it provides amenity for people, it's a biodiversity hotspot. It's a service provider. So a big narrative that persists today is, what can we take from this river? And yeah, that's still here. That's really not going anywhere. But one thing that living entity does is to start enabling us to feel a little gratitude for all of those things. So now we're starting to feel a bit grateful. And the 50-year vision that was created through Wilip-gin Birrarung and that sits alongside Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung's vision for the river as well, starts to frame a narrative around what do we want for the river and for ourselves. And it starts to become relational. So Burndap Birrarung, Burndap Umarkoo, which is the 10-year strategic plan, is the first kind of recognition of what it looks like to give effect to that narrative of what do we want for the river. And that's what is good for the river is good for us all. That's what Burndap Birrarung, Burndap Umarkoo means. And so we're starting to see this shift around, okay, we've taken, but now we're starting to frame a vision of the future where we are articulating a future for ourselves and the river together. And then the third narrative that living entity really makes possible is how do we get to that future together with the river as a partner and a collaborator in its own care. So the river becomes our partner in creating this future. We co-create it together. And living entity enables that narrative to take shape, and it is beginning to grow in the community of people around Birrarung.
If there's one thing I would encourage you to take away from this episode, it is to get out and start having these conversations with Birrarung and with your community. I began this episode with one example of what this could look like, but I think there are as many ways to speak with the river as there are people. Perhaps your first step is noticing which waterways you're commuting alongside or over, or maybe it's joining your local Friends of group to practice some reciprocity. Whatever it is for you, take that first step. We'd also love to hear from you. You can visit morethanhumanpod.net and click the blue microphone icon at the bottom right of the screen and leave us a recorded voicemail. We'd love to hear your reflections and your conversations with Birrarung, or whatever local waterway you live nearest to. In this episode, you heard the voices of Andrew Kelly from the Waterways Alliance, Dr. Erin O'Donnell from the Melbourne Law School and Birrarung Council, Wurundjeri Elder Uncle Andrew Gardner, now the chair of the Birrarung Council, and Claire Dunn from Melbourne Water's Burndap Birrarung Burndap Umarkoo implementation team. You can find out more about our guests and the topics discussed in this episode in the show notes, or head to morethanhumanpod.net and click Dive Deeper. We're assembling a library of resources relevant to each episode for those who want a little bit more. More Than Human is an independent production by me, Tim McIntosh-Hanna, and Mark Spencer from Here Media. Find out more about us at morethanhumanpod.net. And please, leave us a review. Reviews help us move up the rankings on streaming platforms and help us find new audiences. We want to build this community, so if you like our work, leave a comment or rating and share it with everyone that you know. We'll be back next month and zooming out to look at Birrarung in the context of the global rights of nature movement. Join us then for episode 3, Something in the Water.